Hello, and welcome to Conversation Cafe. I'm June Robbins Foreman, founder and host. You are about to watch an interview with Dr. Jayanta Bhattacharya of Stanford University. I first encountered Dr. Jay on Uncommon Knowledge. About 3 years ago, his perspective, which is based on integrity, insight, experience, expertise, and compassion and wisdom, was not being widely heard, and I wondered why. At the beginning of the pandemic, Dr. Bhattacharya advocated for focused protection on the most vulnerable of our society. And to that end, he and Senator Gupta and Martin Kulldorff wrote the Great Barrington Declaration. However, powerful story makers tried to suppress their ideas. Conversation Cafe is committed to releasing perspectives that arise from those individuals whose credibility and integrity are central to their life's work. During this video, I asked that you would give me grace on my interviewing skills. This is not my field of work, but I do feel compelled to get this message out. You will thoroughly enjoy Dr. J's intellect, humility, insight, and integrity. If you wish to find out more about Conversation Cafe, please visit conversationcafe.ca. And thank you for watching. Hi, and welcome to Conversation Cafe. I'm June Robbins Foreman. I'm here today with Dr. Jayanta Bhattacharya of Stanford University. Thank you, Dr. Jay, for agreeing to be on this podcast.
Thank you for coming all this way, June, to talk with me.
My pleasure. I'm going to first let the audience know a little bit about your career history, and then we'll get into it. Dr. Jayanta Bhattacharya is a professor of medicine at Stanford University. He is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research, a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and the Stanford Freeman Spogli Institute. He holds courtesy appointments as professor in economics and in health research and policy. He directs the Stanford Center of the Demography of Health and Aging. Dr. Bhattacharya's research focuses on the economics of healthcare around the world, with a particular emphasis on the health and well-being of vulnerable populations. Dr. Bhattacharya's peer-reviewed research has been published in economics, statistics, legal, medical, public health, and health policy journals. He holds an MD and a PhD in economics from Stanford University. By all accounts, you are a big deal.
I don't know about that, but I've done some work in the past that I think prepared me for thinking about our pandemic response from a broad perspective.
Well, when I look at this and I think about Francis Collins calling up Dr. Anthony Fauci and saying you were part of this fringe element, my question is, what's your sense? Why didn't he pick up the phone and say, Jay, I've read this declaration. What's going on? It's way off base. Let's get together. Why wouldn't he do that?
Well, it was actually kind of heartbreaking because prior to the pandemic, I had a tremendous amount of respect for Tony Fauci and for Francis Collins. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health. And then, as you obviously know, when I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, calling in October of 2020, calling for lifting of lockdowns and better protecting vulnerable older people, Francis Collins wrote an email to Tony Fauci 4 days after he wrote it, calling me a fringe epidemiologist, and calling my co-authors of the declaration, Senator Gupta of Oxford University, a very prominent, she's a vaccine developer, incredible mathematician, epidemiologist. She called her a fringe epidemiologist.
And Martin Kulldorff.
Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, who's actually he's developed some of the key elements of the statistical infrastructure that the US FDA and the CDC uses to track disease outbreaks and vaccine safety. Decades of research and experience. We're not fringe epidemiologists, and yet you had Francis Collins writing to Tony Fauci calling us that. And you asked me why.
Yeah, it's a lie. And what's your sense of really, why didn't he take a different track with this? Why don't, in the halls of academia, why wouldn't somebody have the courtesy to look at a professor such as yourself and say, this guy has credentials, he's doing something here, and I'm interested and I need to find out what's going on?
Well, I think if you put yourself in the shoes of someone like Tony Fauci or Francis Collins, they sit atop this hierarchy on the top of the National Institute of Health, and non-scientists may not understand what this hierarchy means. They dole out tens of billions of dollars of money every year to American biomedical scientists, that actually biomedical scientists around the world. That buys you not just the ability to do your research and run your lab, hire graduate students, and get a couple of publications, which is the coin of the realm in academics. It also buys you social status. It buys you the respect from other scientists. The fact that you have been funded by other scientists, by the NIH, buys you. And in places like Stanford, where I work, you don't get tenure unless you're successful at getting grants from places like the NIH, and the NIH in particular plays a tremendously important role. So people at the top of these hierarchies are used to having people tell them that they're right. They're used to having people, because no one wants to tell Francis Collins or Tony Fauci that they're wrong, because if they do, well, what if their capacity to gain and earn research grants is impacted in some way? That means that their status as scientists is impacted in some way.
But you're talking then about something that has nothing to do with health policy. These things occurred because of ego, maybe, and because of the connection that they could have with getting grants.
Well, so let me just finish. So the key thing then is that the key missing thing in this conversation so far is that Tony Fauci and Francis Collins had signed on to a tremendously draconian policy of lockdowns in spring of 2020. I think
yes, I remember.
Right?
Yeah.
They had staked their reputations on the idea that there was a scientific consensus in favor of the lockdowns, that every reasonable scientist agreed with them that the lockdowns were the only way. Fast forward to October 2020.
Can I just interrupt you? Did they think of that consensus as being scientifically observed? Why did they think it was a consensus?
Because they thought it was a consensus, I think.
Okay.
And they're surrounded by a bubble. People were not going to disagree with them.
So they didn't take a poll, or they didn't ask other.
No.
Okay.
I mean, you normally wouldn't take a poll anyways. What you do is you host a scientific debate and see who shows up and what people have to say. Right? You'd have some sort of like forum for open conversation. And in the summer of 2020, Tony Fauci, who was then advising the task force, the U.S. COVID task force, to the president of the United States, then President Trump, he essentially just viciously attacked my colleague Scott Atlas, who was also on the task force, chosen by President Trump to be on the task force, who had a very different view about the lockdowns, of the efficacy of them, the wisdom of them. And Tony Fauci used every element of his toolkit to try to undermine Scott Atlas in the public eye, to make him see as if he were a fringe figure on the outside of academics, rather than a central figure who used to be the head of neuroradiology at Stanford, was a prominent figure in the health policy world for a decade or more. So they already staked their career, their reputation, on the idea that lockdowns were the right policy and that every reasonable scientist agreed with them.
Okay, so before the pandemic, would you see this kind of behavior from public officials such as Anthony Fauci? Was it the pressure of the pandemic that brought on this lack of inclusivity and a lack of an attempt to try and gain a multiplicity of perspectives?
Yeah, so I mean, looking back, this stuff I learned during the pandemic about this history. Looking back, I think it's actually they have used this tactic before, right? I think most famously, Tony Fauci destroyed the careers of a man named Peter Duesberg at UC Berkeley, and a man named Kerry Mullins, who was a Nobel Prize winner, inventor of the polymerase chain reaction, the PCR. In fact, that same test has been used very famously during the pandemic. Duesberg had a hypothesis, I think an incorrect hypothesis, that the cause of AIDS, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, that killed so many gay men and hemophiliacs and others, IV drug users, throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s, that the cause of AIDS was not HIV, not the virus HIV. There were other causes. I think that hypothesis was wrong. But for Tony Fauci, who was the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, he used every bit of power he had to destroy the careers and reputations of these men, simply because he disagreed with them about a scientific hypothesis.
That's extremely troubling. So for myself and for the audience to learn that somebody in this position with this amount of power will advantage himself rather than including the greatest minds of the time and saying, what do you think? It sounds like it's more common than we knew.
Yeah, and during the pandemic, I've seen two very prominent examples of exactly this, right? So we just talked about the fringe up, me being Francis Collins calling me Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff fringe epidemiologists. The goal there was to tell other scientists that we were to be excommunicated, shunned. Right. The goal was to create in the public mind an illusion of consensus in favor of lockdown, the illusion that somehow all scientists agreed when they did not actually agree, that there were, in fact, prominent scientists, tens of thousands of scientists signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration. For instance, including epidemiologists, doctors, and so on. Nobel Prize winner Mike Levitt here at Stanford signed on. It was I knew from talking with colleagues that there was no consensus. That's why we wrote the declaration. We wanted to start a scientific debate.
I think you coined the term medical clergy. Is that right?
Medical clerisy, yeah.
Clerisy, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you continue, but recently Sinead O'Connor had died. She actually at one point ripped up a picture of somebody in the clergy, and then the next day she was asked about it. And she said, I was not told the truth from those who were killing all other truth. Are these individuals actually killing truth? Are they suppressing it? Are they?
I think that just to put as good faith a spin on it as I can, but because I think that's most constructive. I think that they thought they were right, and that people that disagreed with them were saying things that would undermine in the public mind the perception that they were right, and that this would lead to policy that would be dangerous.
Yeah, but you're saying two things though. You're saying he destroyed people's careers.
Yes.
That's intentional. That's not, oh, I think I'm right and I think you're wrong, and let's discuss
but let's just go one step. Okay. So they think that what I'm saying is so dangerous that it's going to result in policies that will result in the deaths of other people. And so they
thought that.
I'm pretty sure they thought
you're
that.
Giving them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they thought that.
Why wouldn't they call you and say, let's have a conversation about this? This is what's so
that is where I think I agree with you. It was irresponsible for them not to have that conversation, because what kind of hubris leads them to think that they are so much in possession of the truth that they can't be corrected by other people?
Yeah,
even people with reasonable credentials to correct them, right? So, and I might have been wrong. I mean, I think Duisberg and Carrie Mullis was wrong about HIV does cause AIDS, but I think that that conversation could have been had without destroying their careers.
I think one of the things I appreciate about you, as I've been watching you over the years, is the very statement you just made. I could have been wrong. I heard on one podcast when you created the Barrington Declaration, you said it wasn't to be the absolute policy, it was to be put on the table, and it was an invitation for people to have their say about it. And when we see somebody in public health who has the integrity to say, here's my idea, here's my thoughts, and I'm an expert, here's the best outcome I think we could have, but I'm willing to hear other people. It induces huge amounts of trust. And it's because you were censored that I became very curious, very curious and quite skeptical. And that's the danger, because the vaccines could be fabulous, but because there's censorship, all of a sudden my bias is leaning. And I've had to really check myself to see, okay, am I doing this because I just want my bias to be confirmed? I need to go and listen to a multiplicity of doctors who have differences of opinion. And by all accounts, that's what science is. It's a collaboration and a conversation.
It's fundamentally humble.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's
fundamentally humble, right? I mean, I think if you haven't been wrong as a scientist, you're not really acting as a scientist, right? And in fact, my greatest joy, although it's painful sometimes at the time, is when my students correct me, right? Because
Uh-huh.
like then now, I learned something. That's all. That's as painful as that can sometimes be. That's good. B, they see that it has nothing to do with status or differences in where you are in the hierarchy. I call it the high clerisy of are you a high clerisy or are you down at the bottom? All that
Right.
matters is, are you right? Are you right about the idea? Is the evidence consistent with the idea? And so the most humble person can end up being right in science. It's a wonderful, humbling thing. And that's actually the great strength of science, is never having that absolute sense of certainty so much that I can then suppress all the people that disagree with me about my ideas.
So the science is not settled.
So I mean, I think now that the evidence has come in, the lockdowns were a tremendous failure. There are ideas in science that have more evidence behind them than less. I'm not saying you can never learn things in science. There are things that I think you can learn, but I think that the attitude should always be, well, that the knowledge is provisional. There may be another fact I haven't thought about, a way of thinking about it I haven't seen, data points that should be collected that haven't been collected yet, that might end up with me revising my view. That there should always be that possibility, so that I wouldn't act in ways to destroy that possibility from happening, simply to make people think I was right.
Okay, so I want to switch a little bit and talk about the raw data from.
So one more thing, because I promised you
Go ahead.
2 examples of Tony Fauci and Francis Collins doing this.
Yes.
And I talked about HIV. I talked about the fringe epidemiology. They also did this with the potential origin of the virus.
Yeah.
And so in January 2020, when the world was very worried about this emerging pandemic in Japan, in China, there's FOIA Freedom of Information Act evidence that Tony Fauci and Francis Collins engaged in a cover-up of the possibility that this virus was potentially a result of a lab leak based on research funded by the NIH in China. And they slandered and tried to destroy the careers of scientists who spoke up and said it's possibly a lab leak. It's the same playbook they used, calling essentially, they didn't use the word fringe that I've seen, but like effectively calling people who disagreed with them about the lab leak fringe figures, as if they were somehow on the outskirts, even though they're very prominent scientists marshaling what, to my eyes, looks like good evidence that it might very well have been a lab leak.
And recently there's been discussion around the fact that they had conversations where they actually said this could be a potential lab leak, and then they covered it up and went with the proximal origins paper.
Yeah, that's what that proximal origins paper is, the paper that was published in spring 2020 by the Lancet. And it's very clear that Francis Collins and Tony Fauci played a big role in the convening of the group that wrote that paper. And that proximal origins paper effectively said that the lab leak debate was already settled in spring of 2020. No, in fact, they said it was settled in favor of natural origins, like some bat soup or something. They don't actually have the animal, right? And yet they say that it's already settled. And that anyone disagrees is essentially, I mean, that was the implication, is a conspiracy theorist.
Are we ever going to find out?
I mean, I think the evidence is very rapidly emerging. We have like the definitive, everyone agrees. I think that's going to be too difficult, because there's so many people whose careers are implicated by, if it is a lab leak, then that means that the like huge chunks of the field of virology and this whole pandemic preparedness industry that goes into bat caves in China and all the wild places, pull those viruses into large population centers to do very dangerous research on. All that has to end, and they're going to look like, in effect, like they caused the pandemic, right? If that's the conclusion. So those people are never going to agree to it. But those are the same people that have the expertise and principle, if they were neutral figures, to actually make that judgment.
Did you have an opinion on this type of work in labs before the pandemic?
I didn't.
No, I didn't even know that it was happening. I'm sure most of the public didn't know that there was this gain of function research going on within these labs.
I mean, I was vaguely aware of it, but my sense before, I know there was some controversy around whether whether it was dangerous or not. But my sense was that the NIH was doing a good job regulating these labs, but nothing I'd actually looked into. It was just my general trust of the NIH and the regulatory agencies. that trust is shattered. I mean, and now in retrospect, they clearly weren't doing a very good regulatory, job regulating the safety of these labs.
Okay, I want to switch a little bit and just talk about the efficacy of the vaccine. There's data coming out from Pfizer now. It's being dumped in bits and pieces. The reports say they didn't want to release this data for 55 years. That's a conservative estimate. I've also heard 75 years. The people are analyzing this data. And so what is public health aware of because of this data? And I want that question, but also given the caliber of this situation, why was there not an independent body invited to analyze the data originally? Why did it take a FOIA request and pressure on Pfizer to release this data? Why was there not an independent body along with whatever company, the Pfizer company, analyzing the data? And what are we finding out about that data now?
Okay, so for vaccine efficacy, you don't need to talk about the Pfizer data analysis because a lot of it's already out in public, right? Even before this lawsuit, it was already out in public.
Okay,
So you can look at the randomized trial that was published in December 2020. And of course, Pfizer's not the only vaccine. There was and if you're just doing mRNA vaccines, the Moderna vaccine, there was the adenovector virus vaccines like the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Then there are more traditional vaccines like Novavax and a whole suite of other vaccines developed in other countries. So they weren't the only company developing vaccines. They're just the most prominent and the ones with the biggest deals with countries. The randomized trial data published in December 2020 for the Pfizer vaccine, we'll just stick with that, was a very large trial, tens of thousands of people, randomized into two arms and followed for 2 or 3 months. Mm-hmm. The trial, as it was designed to check whether the vaccine versus the placebo arm protected against people getting symptomatic infection. They defined the protection starting as 2 weeks after you're fully vaccinated, right? 2 doses and 2 weeks after that. And so starting that as a time clock, then looking forward 2 or 3 months, how many people in the placebo arm get infected, how many people in the vaccine arm get infected, right? And that's where the famous 95% protection comes from, right? So in that study, 95% of the population that was in the vaccine arm versus the placebo arm, there was a 95% reduction in the probability of becoming symptomatically infected for 2 months. That's now, if you look at that from the eyes of an epidemiologist, or health policy person, what you see, at least is what I saw, is that they didn't check to see if the vaccine stops disease transmission. They could have, right? They could have checked to see if people in the same house, how likely they were to get sick, right? So if the vaccine stops transmission, then the people who were vaccinated, their spouses should have been infected at lower rates than the people in the placebo arm.
That would have been a fairly easy study to
Very easy to do, right? But they didn't report that then.
And why? What was the rationale for?
I mean, so you asked me a question about regulatory bodies. So we're getting. Sorry, it takes a little while to get. You ask all these interesting questions, June. You got to get to them slowly. Get one at a time. So you don't know. I didn't know. I couldn't tell from the study as it was published whether it stopped transmission. It was a study that lasted 2 or 3 months, right? So I don't know what happens to the protection after those 2 or 3 months. And in fact, what Pfizer did at the time was they unblinded the study. Now, what does unblinded mean? That means that they randomly assign people to the placebo or the vaccine, but the people themselves don't know.
Yeah.
And neither do the doctors.
Double blind.
Right. And so when you unblind, you tell everybody, oh, you actually got the placebo. Now, the argument that they gave, which is not an unreasonable argument, I've seen this in other studies, is that, look, the vaccine was so effective at stopping symptomatic infection, it's not ethical to subject the placebo group to continued risk when we know it works to protect against symptomatic infection. That's fine. It's a creditable argument. The problem, though, is as far as the information from the studies now then ended at 3 months, 2 or 3 months. You're never going to know from a randomized study what would have happened if the study had gone on longer directly. Right. So, but let's put ourselves back in December of 2020. What you know is 2 or 3 months of protection against symptomatic infection. We don't know if it stops transmission. And that's, you might say, well, look, if it stops symptomatic infection, it automatically must stop transmission, right? But that's not actually a reasonable inference.
But is that not the traditional definition of a vaccine?
The traditional definition of the vaccine is an agent that induces a immune response that mimics the response you get to the pathogen itself, such that when you're exposed to the pathogen, you get that immune response that will help mitigate the harm from the vaccine, from the pathogen. That's the traditional. I mean, I don't want to get into discussions about whether this is or is not a vaccine. I mean, it has that kind of feature, right? Okay. It induces a mix. I think that's just. I mean, I'm sure legal people will talk about whether it's important to call it a vaccine or not. I'm not a legal person. I'm just saying it has the kinds of features that a vaccine generally would have. We can debate how effectively it has those features. In fact, that's what we're doing right now. Right. So the Pfizer the product, the vaccine, you give it, and you know that it stops symptomatic infection, but you don't know that it stops transmission. If it stops symptomatic infection, that doesn't necessarily mean that it stops infection, because you can very easily have asymptomatic infection, right? And it's possible to spread the disease with that, or very, very few symptoms. So it doesn't, come to the attention of somebody, of the doctor or something, right? The other thing that the Pfizer trial didn't have, and I noticed this at the time, in December of 2020 when they published it, it didn't have a very large number of older people in the study. It was a lot of younger people. Now, again, you can tell a story why they did that, because you're giving this product that's experimental. You generally would give it to younger, healthier people, because then they could recover from it if it goes bad, right? Whereas if you give it to a very sick population, they wouldn't. But at the same time, the people who are at highest risk from the disease itself are older people. I mean, that is the goal of that's the empirical basis of the Great Barrington Declaration. It's really older people that face the highest risk from this virus.
And you actually had said that in another podcast that you did, that the focus of protection should be on the most vulnerable, which is
that's reasonable. Like you see who's really, really at risk, and you devote resources to protect those people. Why devote resources, scarce resources that away from protecting people that really can be harmed, toward trying to protect people that aren't really at huge risk, especially when those resources may end up harming the people. That closing schools is a good example of this, harming the people you're seeking to protect. The trial didn't actually have a very large number of older people, and it didn't have as an outcome prevention of hospitalizations, or prevention of death as primary endpoints of the trial. And in fact, if you looked at the supplementary tables, there was no difference, at least no statistically meaningful difference detectable between the placebo arm and the vaccine arm in terms of prevention of death.
That's a huge reveal, I think, for the general population.
But it was there in the tables in public, so you don't even have to go to the secret Pfizer data. It was there in public, right, in December 2020.
Well, why are corporate media stations not reporting on that? Well, that's the clip that Kashish and I saw last night, and we said that can't be true. And then Aseem Malhotra was talking about relative risk versus help me out, another kind of risk.
Absolute risk reduction.
Absolute risk. And apparently relative risk is 95% effective. And
so like just to give the audience some sense of what that means, like the difference is, imagine that you have 1 in a million risk of dying from something. And I reduce that risk by 90%. All right, so now it's 1 in 10 million. So you go from 1 in a million to 1 in 10 million. That's a 90% risk reduction. Do you care?
No.
That's
I
absolutely,
mean, a little bit, because somebody's dying,
Yeah,
but,
1 in a million.
but do I care when,
let's go from 1 in a billion to 1 in 10 billion. Now
Yeah.
that's a 90% risk reduction. Do you
this,
care?
this is so troubling when this was known and there are mandates being imposed on people.
But at the same time,
Okay.
June, there are groups of people for whom the absolute risk is high, right? So if you're 80 years old, put yourself again in December of 2020 and the virus is spreading, the mortality rate, I think, the infection fatality rate for someone who's 80 years old, who gets infected for the first time, never having seen the virus before, was something like 4, 5, 6%. Very, very high, right? So 1 in 20.
Yes.
I mean, so that's a very high number
Very
for
scary.
a single, and so for that group, if you reduce the absolute risk by 90%, the relative risk by 90%, that's a pretty big absolute risk reduction.
Can you explain that a
So
little?
again, so like, let's say it's 1 in 20 of dying.
Yeah.
Without the vaccine and you're immune naive, and you get the vaccine and it reduces the risk of dying by 90%. Now it's 1 in 200. It's a big reduction.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Right? 1 in 20 to 1 in 200. Whereas a child might be 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, especially for very young children. And you go from 1 in a million to 1 in 10 million, almost no real risk reduction. And that's also a 90% risk reduction.
You have to explain to myself and to the audience, why was this story not told? Why were we not told all of this and presented with this information? And you would say, as my doctor, you might say, June, you're at sort of medium risk. You're not within that younger age category where there's almost no risk. Let's talk about, you might have some comorbidities that would lead me to think you should get this vaccine. All of these parts of the story were not only not suppressed, we didn't know. Everybody was listening to CTV, CBC, global news in Canada anyways, and we were just told safe and effective, safe and effective.
Yeah.
You had said early on in the pandemic, this is a striated disease. We knew coming out of China, the data coming out of China, that it affected the elderly much more severely than it did the young people. It's astounding. We're almost 4 years into this, and I still think people don't know the whole story. And I want to understand why.
I mean, I think that
it can't just be about, I'm right, I'm going to get my funding, ego, whatever. It would be so troubling to really believe that.
Well, so I think, like, okay, so there's one other piece,
and the other option is there's such chaos among the professionals of public health. You all need to get it together and do something so that every aspect of the story comes out. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I think that that the public health officials in Canada and the United States, so many countries, made tremendous mistakes in understanding the nature of the disease quick enough. And they recommended things to the public on the basis of a wrong understanding of the disease that was essentially frozen in amber from the earliest days of the pandemic.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is I had a misconception of health authorities. You're saying they got it wrong early on in the pandemic. And I think maybe the disconnect for me is I would never imagine that they could get it wrong. I'm like a lot of the population. There's a system here that's meant to protect us. And they're working hard, and they're discovering vaccines and developing protocols, et cetera. Of course, they're going to be right. And so maybe it's public perception that was wrong to begin with.
Well, public perception, I think, followed from public health messaging, right? So from the earliest days of the pandemic, it was a virtue to overestimate the harm from this disease to the population at large. That fear, which I thought before the pandemic would be something that public health would work against, they would work to reassure the public when it was needed to reassure, to tamp down on the possibility of panic. Instead, public health decided that it was a virtue to cause the public to fear, such that people still overestimate the harm from the disease still today. And actually, weirdly, for people who are really at high risk, that some of them actually underestimated it. Like, so if you're over 80, you may not know that you were really high risk relative to everybody else, or 70 or whatever, right? Um, so that fear then created a constituency in the public that made it very difficult for public health to then say, oh, we got it wrong. Right. And of course, there's, as I said earlier, reputations are at play. And so the messaging was that everybody's at equal risk.
Wait a minute, you said they admitted they got it wrong?
No, they had a very difficult time admitting it. They still haven't admitted it.
Oh, okay, that's what yeah. I just wanted to clarify.
They still haven't admitted it. I mean, and so they got it wrong at the beginning about this risk stratification. And as a result of that, they adopted policies that were mistaken. They underestimated how transmissible this virus is. And so they had it in there as a basis for their thinking. Let's put in policies that will flatten the curve. And in the back of their minds, they're thinking maybe we can get to zero. When in fact there was no evidence from almost the beginning of the pandemic, from January 2020 on, I think, there was no evidence that any of these policies could effectively get it. In fact, I'd say it seems likely that the virus was circulating in China, at least, and probably other places in fall, mid to late fall 2019, that it was already too late by March of 2020 for the lockdown to do anything. The virus was here to stay. That was the lesson that we should have been operating under. Instead, public health was operating under the idea that if they could induce the public to obey all these draconian orders, then we could get to a world where the virus was gone.
They really believe that?
I think in the back of their heads they thought that, yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's the only good faith interpretation I can give to this. And there are other people that were acting in.
Well, I'm trying to think of the timeline, but the messaging I remember is it's going to be here. We know it's going to always be with us from early on, for certain in 2020. That was
controversial, and there was a big movement in October 2020, for instance, when released the Great Barrington Declaration. There was a group of scientists that wrote and said, look, these lockdown measures are necessary until the vaccine comes. There are others. There's a zero COVID movement in Europe, in the US, and Canada. And Canada actually is pretty prominent.
Yeah.
Where they said, okay, what we just do have to restructure all of society to get the virus from spreading. All we have to do is do that for what, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, all locked down and all go away. Right? That was the premise.
And even if it was the case, and it might have come to pass, once it started to be revealed that the vaccines did not stop transmission, we didn't adjust policy.
Right. So that's okay. So go back to the vaccine story. The trials don't show that they stopped transmission because they didn't look. They show they stopped symptomatic infection for 2 months. Public health, including people like Tony Fauci, including people like Theresa Tam in Canada, they take on the idea somehow, based on nothing, that this vaccine stops transmission. Okay, so now what are the effects of that? If you think this vaccine stops transmission, then what you need is a very large fraction of the population, and you also think that there's no natural immunity. There's no immunity after COVID recovery.
That's a whole nother story. Unbelievable.
Yeah, we'll cut with this. So okay, so you believe that, right? You believe that. And the World Health Organization puts out they revise their definition of herd immunity to exclude immunity after COVID recovery and focus only on the vaccine.
Yeah, I cannot accept that they believe that.
Believe that, I think.
Yeah.
But it's that belief is not based on scientific evidence. It's based on hope. It's based on extrapolation from a trial that doesn't show that because they didn't look. And okay, so what are the policy effects of that? So if the vaccine makes it so that I don't get the disease and I can't spread the disease, now all of a sudden there's this division in the population between the clean vaccinated people and the unclean unvaccinated. It gives carte blanche to policymakers to say, well, look, let's divide the population. Let's make the lives of the unvaccinated miserable. Let's essentially treat them like second-class citizens because they're unclean. They're the ones that are spreading the disease. They're the ones that are irresponsibly not protecting the rest of the population with their irresponsible actions. They're the other. And I saw Justin Trudeau do this in spades, essentially. Macron,
Jacinda Ardern,
Biden, every single Western leader did this. They divided their populations into a clean and unclean, based on something that was not true, not known to be true, and should never, and even if it were true, should never have been used to do what they did. Right? It wasn't true that the vaccine prevented you from getting and spreading the disease.
Well, I'd be curious to find out why it would not be okay if it was true. But I don't want to.
Well, I mean, I think we are in the notion of human rights says that we should not, under any circumstances, treat people as if they're unclean.
However, and I've heard it many times, it's selfish if I can do something that's going to protect my community. And I get that.
People are selfish in many, many, many ways, June, but we don't treat them as if they're unclean, as if it should be excommunicated for society because of their selfishness. I mean, I believe that we're all selfish in some way or other. That doesn't give anyone else warrant to excommunicate large chunks of society and say you're a second-class citizen.
Okay, but
that's a separate issue, right?
But I do want to explore it a little bit, because I have been the weight of that has been on many people to examine ourselves and say, okay, am I being selfish? Because if I take this vaccine, I am going to be able to protect my community and it's going to stop transmission, et cetera, et cetera. But from earlier on, there was data coming out of Israel that the vaccine waned. I had everybody has stories, but I had a friend who's a nurse, and she took the training to give people the vaccine. And she said during the training, she saw that we would need 4 vaccines a year, and whether it was accurate at the time or not. It's because of that information that I had, however I obtained it, that I thought, wait a minute. So I would say, like, okay, that's my question. So where then is the threshold, or when do I say to myself, no, I absolutely have to take this vaccine or this medicine? But now it's complicated because there is this situation called the COVID pandemic, where information was given, not given, suppressed, killed, whatever. And now when the next pandemic comes along and you say, June, take this vaccine, I'm going to say, okay, wait a minute. Who do I trust? And what is going to be put in place so that we can develop more trust with public health? That's one of my questions, and I'm kind of bouncing around, but this entire situation has created a need for a revamping of public health. And I know you had talked to Dr. Peterson and you were talking about the future of public health, and I do want to get there. What are the checks and balances going to be? How are we going to conduct ourselves? And what are you doing to make it better?
Okay, so now she set up a whole agenda here, Jim. Let's take this one at a time, right? So let's stay on the topic of the social obligation people have to take something like a vaccine.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, I think it's a complicated question, right? So I think, for instance, that it may be the case that for some people the vaccine is not medically warranted for them, or at least there's insufficient evidence that it's medically warranted for them personally. And I don't think, as in medicine, it's right to ask people to undergo procedures or take medicines that harm them. Right? We have an ethical prohibition against that, because and it's a wise prohibition, not just because you protect the patient, but that's probably the most important thing, but it also makes it so that patients can trust doctors. Right? If you go to your doctor, you should expect that they're not going to tell you to do something that's going to harm you. You should have that expectation as part of the relationship you have with your physician. And
then somebody sets the criteria for whether or not you can claim this is going to harm me.
Right? Well, okay, but let's just say, like, the doctor thinks that this is, they think that this thing might harm you, and they recommend it anyways. Well, that doctor has violated your trust, right? So that's the question, right? So so the question then is, you have a vaccine that doesn't that doesn't actually prevent transmission, as you're right. And there's evidence from early 2021, so let's say from out of Israel, it's late spring, early summer 2021, the vaccine is not stopping transmission. So this question about like, does it harm you? What's the social obligation? Then it's all set aside, because there is no social obligation when the vaccine now becomes a matter of a private decision. Right?
Mhm.
Does it protect me against severe disease is a very different question. Does my vaccine protect you against you getting the disease? We already know then because of the Israeli data and other countries that it doesn't, my vaccine doesn't protect you. We also know that from a tremendous amount of evidence that people who've recovered from COVID have protection against getting infected and transmitting. That's better than the vaccine. Again, data out of Israel show this. Again, in early 2021 and mid 2021. So the question about the social obligation to be vaccinated then is you don't even need to go there, because the vaccine doesn't have that same social. The vaccinated are not more clean than the unvaccinated in the sense of being more likely to spread the disease to you.
Yeah, but the question is, did public health officials know that when they were mandating, shaming, public messaging? They did. I believe that they did. If you look at the timeline, and I heard in Canada, I listen to the CBC radio all the time. Dr. Bonnie Henry and Health Minister Adrian Dix got on the radio and said, you know, if your friends and your family are unvaccinated, don't have them coming over for Christmas dinner. And to this day in British Columbia, healthcare workers have not been invited back. So the science is different, and I actually like that, because you know, you have individuals making policies according to how they read the data, which is fine. But why is it that in British Columbia healthcare professionals are not invited back, and in Alberta they are?
Right. So I think that the public health officials, the public health officials that were making that advice to the public were misreading the scientific data in 2020, certainly by mid 2021. They should have known that the vaccine was not stopping transmission, and they should have reacted to that by changing their advice. They should never have made advice they should never have given the public advice to treat the unvaccinated as unclean. They should never have done that. But certainly when it became very clear in the scientific data that the vaccine was not stopping transmission, then they should have changed their advice away from that.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think it was very irresponsible that public health officials in December 2021 were telling people don't invite your unvaccinated relatives over for Christmas. That is something that public health shouldn't, even if it were true that vaccines stop transmission, that's something that public health, that's far beyond the authority of public health officials to the moral authority to advise or not advise. It
seemed like a creepy dystopian movie when I heard these public messages coming on. It was, but I'm still not convinced. There has to be, not has to be, but perhaps there's a situation, and could you explain it to me and to the audience? When is it my responsibility? What is the situation where you would say, no, if you don't do this?
So I think everyone's going to differ on this based on their own moral stances, right? So I personally believe, and I think most honest moral doctors would agree with this, that it's never appropriate for medicine or public health to recommend that somebody take an action that harms them. Right? That we have an obligation in our advice to get to tell people to or recommend things that we think are reasonably going to provide some benefit and without too much cost or harm to the person that we're giving that advice to. We should not say your 6-year-old child should serve as a shield for adults. Your 6-year-old child should be harmed so that adults can survive.
Well, they didn't think that children were going to be harmed, though. I mean,
well, of course, the question. So, like the vaccine, we've been talking about the effectiveness of the vaccine versus transmission, but we don't know all of the side effects of the vaccine. And we
know some of them now.
Well, we do now, but back then, let's say in early 2021, we didn't know all of them. Vaccine side effects are often learned about over time. I think that, for instance, the fact that this vaccine causes high rates of myocarditis we can argue about exactly how high. I mean, I've seen numbers as low as 1 in 2,000. I mean, I don't know. I think that's probably too high a rate. Than it's likely lower than that. But whatever. That's not the relevant thing. The relevant thing is that we didn't know exactly the vaccine, the rates. But that rate of 1 in 2,000 is in young men, right? That's a surprise. We didn't know that. It's when you have that uncertainty, you have a new vaccine out, and you have some uncertainty about its side effects, you have to be very careful about making an assumption that there aren't going to be side effects. The responsible thing to do is to say, well, there may be side effects. And the question is the benefit that you're going to get from the vaccine, which you've seen in trials and then also in some epidemiological data, is it worth taking that risk of potential future harm where we discover some.
And you would discuss that with your doctor, hopefully.
Right. So we now have talked about two different models: one a public health model, and one a moral standard medicine model. One that I was proposing the second. Tell people to go talk to their doctor and see if the vaccine is right for them. Right? And it's an individual question. Have you had COVID before and recovered? Well, the vaccine probably has less of a benefit for you then, because you've already have some benefit from the protection provided by the COVID recovery. Are you older? Well, the vaccine is probably more beneficial to you than if you're younger, because COVID is the absolute risk reduction is much higher for people who are older, face a high risk from COVID. So that's a nuanced discussion that's going to be patient by patient by patient. And there's no social obligation to be vaccinated. There's just, is the vaccine right for you from your own medical point of view? The public health view was there's a social obligation, and it doesn't matter whether it's right for you or not. You owe it to the public to be vaccinated, because if you get vaccinated, you're going to become a dead end for the disease. The disease won't affect you. You won't transmit it. That was based on as we talked about the trial, that was not based on any scientific evidence at the time. It was based on an extrapolation on the trial data, far beyond what you could, I think, reasonably infer from the trial data. And based on the extrapolation, I saw the current the former CDC director in the U.S. say that they all adopted this idea based on hope. They hoped it would work the way they thought it did.
Well, I think I heard her say it based on watching CNN.
I mean, so in any case, however they derived this, that hope was a bad basis on which to make policy. And that hope turned out to be not true. In fact, the data showed that very, very early in late spring 2021, summer 2021, that the vaccine doesn't protect you from getting COVID. In fact, I got the vaccine, full doses, 2 doses by April of 2021. And then 4 months later, I got COVID.
I remember.
Yeah.
I do have to bring this up. So this recent study of the spike protein, the S1 protein, crossing the blood-brain barrier in mice. What are the implications for the vaccine spike? So I'm watching a podcast, and Dr. Patrick said it's the burden of proof. So she's saying, first of all, you can't compare the protein from the vaccine to the protein from the virus, because there was a configuration of the virus. 2 amino acids were injected into the spike, and therefore it could not embed itself into cells, et cetera, et cetera. So then she says, so what we need to do is put the burden of proof that onto those that are saying the spike protein from the vaccine is causing harm or is dangerous. Do you agree with that?
Okay, so I tend to reason from epidemiological and clinical data rather than a priori biological reasoning. I think a lot of times that a priori biological reasoning leads you to in directions that don't pan out in the epidemiological data, right? So the question then is, does the vaccine cause brain injury in a very large number of people? Does COVID cause brain injury in a very large number of people? I've seen no evidence in the epidemiological literature that either is true. A lot of people have had COVID. A lot of people had the vaccine. I do see evidence that the lockdowns caused a tremendous amount of depression and anxiety at very, very high rates. That's clear in the epidemiological data. So I don't know. I mean, I guess the answer is I would to say to that is I don't know. I mean, it's interesting that these biological mechanisms are being brought about, but how important are they in reality, in real world? It's the clinical data and the epidemiological data that determine that.
Well, then I'm going to ask, how many people have been injured, seriously injured from the vaccine?
I don't
And
know the answer to that question, but it's definitely more than zero and probably less than 7 billion.
so I don't know where that number is coming from.
Well, I think there's 7 billion people or something like that, maybe 8.
And you know how many people have died from the vaccine?
Again, I don't know the answer to that. And it's probably more than 0 and less than 7 billion.
Okay, so we're in 4 years into this pandemic. We're coming out of it. How come public health doesn't know the answer to these questions?
So that is a really interesting question. And I think you brought up the regulatory bodies before. That actually is the responsibility of regulatory bodies like the CDC, US CDC, the US FDA, in Canada, the public health officials. It's their job to address questions like that, to honestly grapple with them, to bring in, not just to commission research themselves, although at this point I'm not sure how much I trust the research they commission, but also to bring in outside voices to weigh in on that. These kinds of questions need to be addressed with some subtlety and nuance and openness and honesty. And that's going to take a lot of people with different perspectives weighing in on it, looking at the data. In order to get an answer, and so your question then is, why have we not done that thus far?
And I also want to know how many deaths have been prevented and how many serious injuries have been prevented because of the vaccine. So conversely, do we know?
Again, I don't know. Again, but I think it's more than 0 and less than 7 billion. I mean, I'm being a little facetious. So I think the range is narrower than that. I mean, I think both those questions deserve an answer. Like the public needs to know. And there have been scientists that tried to look at this in the outside, but the field in epidemiology, the top journals are only publishing one side, right? They'll publish, I think, incorrect, implausible estimates of how many lives are saved by the vaccine based on modeling data as opposed to straight up epidemiological facts, right? So they'll say, well, look, we projected based on some incorrect model that X million people would get the disease, Y million people would die from it. Only Z million people died from it. So Y minus Z million are saved by the vaccine. That's incorrect reasoning. What you want is to compare populations that are highly vaccinated versus populations that weren't. You want to account for the age structure of the population, how much immunity after COVID recovery how much natural immunity was already present. It's when was the vaccine rolled out of those places versus other places? There's all kinds of things you can potentially do to try to answer those questions.
I want them answered. I'm a consumer of public health.
But I'll tell you the real difficulty is that we're never going to have an answer that's completely unimpeachable, because the randomized trial was stopped after 2 or 3 months, right? All of those kinds of studies have their own biases. And the randomized trial data, you could say that they're biased, but they're much less biased. And because it was stopped after 2 months, we're never going to have a completely convincing answer to that question.
And you're saying it's reasonable that they stopped because they knew that the harm that they could be preventing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very difficult, if you're on the ethics board, it's a very difficult question, right? So you have patients that you owe a responsibility to who are in the placebo arm that you believe are being harmed by being in the placebo arm. At the same time, you owe the public this information about what happens if you continue the trial, which could be crucial to saving the lives of many people in the public. I mean, I don't envy the people that were on that ethics board that made that call to say, let's end the trial. But the fact is, because they ended the trial, we will never have a definitive answer to that question that everyone will agree to. It's always going to be some debate. I'll say, so like the data I've seen, like with these modeling studies, do not convince me. I think they're poor, methodologically poor, that say that we save millions of lives with the vaccine. I don't believe that the studies establish that. I do believe that a lot of lives were saved with the vaccine, but I don't know how many.
Okay. I'm going to circle back to the Great Barrington Declaration. I was in a conversation with some really intelligent people 17,000 people signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration, if I'm
A million.
a million.
Almost a million people signed on, but like, and tens of thousands of doctors and epidemiologists signed on.
And
Yeah.
a Nobel laureate. I think I thought it was, well, for whatever reason. So my friends come back and say, well, what about the millions of doctors who didn't? My question to you is, doctors in general, I don't know researchers, but just the everyday doctor, do they have time? Do they have the not the ability, but do they have time to read all the information? Were most decisions around the vaccine made because of research knowledge, because of their expertise, or was it I'm going to follow the CDC and the FDA?
I mean, I think it's the latter. I think that practicing doctors, I mean, there are a lot of great exceptions where people, I know doctors who will form their independent opinion, of course. But for the vast majority of practicing doctors, it's a matter of seeing what their colleagues are doing, of what the they may go to some continuing medical education event where some expert presents to them, and then they just adopt the view of that.
And that kind of seems reasonable to me. If a doctor is part of this overall structure where the CDC is supposed to do all this and then informs them this is the best course of action, I think that's reasonable. But I don't think that anymore. There's just such a massive distrust now.
Well, I think a couple of things. One, I agree with you that as a general matter, given the range of diseases and conditions that doctors manage, they have to, in some sense, offload some of the thinking to bodies that have more time to think about them, right? So they adopt the position that scientific bodies, people like Tony Fauci, think.
Until you start mandating it, then I think it gets to this next level where if I'm a doctor and I know it's being mandated, I think I ought to know. I think I ought to be now invested.
So I had two things, right? So the second thing is that when you have a new condition like this, right? You're going to automatically have doctors disagreeing with each other about things that they're based on like what they're seeing in their practice. You saw this, for instance, with the debate over early treatment.
Yeah.
Right. You saw some doctors very strongly coming out and saying, well, I know this.
Don't say it.
Whatever,
I want this on YouTube.
what you do want to do. So some early treatments work. And you have other doctors saying, look, researchers saying, look, this doesn't work. These randomized trials. And normally doctors would share this information with each other, and a consensus would slowly emerge from the bottom
up. That's what Pierre Corey said. He said in times past, we had doctors informing policy as well as policy makers collaborating with doctors, but there was this complete switch where as a doctor, you couldn't say anything.
Yeah, and we're afraid of getting banned on YouTube or whatever over just saying the word.
Yeah.
But I think the thing about it is like the nature of medical practice has been pretty fundamentally changed, at least in the developed world. It's a much more corporate practice than it once was, right? So in the United States, many doctors now work for firms rather than running their own practice. In Canada, most doctors work for the Canadian government or for the provincial governments, right? And it's very difficult when you have the corporate office saying, here's our policy, to say, I don't agree as a doctor, right? It's because your job is at stake. A lot doctors in Canada and the United States have lost their jobs for disagreeing.
Yes, they have.
Livelihood,
yes,
right?
they have.
Absolutely. So you're put in now maybe in a bygone age, whereas a lot of like doctors were in independent practice and they really didn't have a boss other than themselves. They could feel free happily to disagree. And maybe some doctors wouldn't send them their patients for referral, but they would get other doctors to send them. The economic livelihood wasn't dependent on agreeing.
Right. There's so much more tied into the system. If you want to finish your thought, but I really want to then go to what is going on with the future of public health.
Oh, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
I remember from like, what is it, 15 minutes ago, you asked me the question. Like, yeah, I promise. I'm very, very concerned about that. So I definitely want to talk about that. But so I think, so you have these like, you have these doctors who normally in a very different structure would have spoken up, but don't. because their economic livelihood depends on it. But nevertheless, despite that, you have tens of thousands of doctors signing the Great Barrington Declaration. You have people who put their entire careers on the line, and many of them lost their jobs. In Canada, I've talked to many doctors who essentially like weren't allowed to practice anymore, even though they have a distinguished career in medicine, where with like huge numbers of patients treated successfully. We're very happy with them. Nevertheless, that wasn't enough. The medical boards in Canada weaponized against physicians that disagreed with public health. Same is true in the United States and in Europe. So it's heartbreaking because like normally you would allow many minds to weigh in on a topic like this, on a new virus. Instead, we decided that we were going to put in social structures so that people who disagreed would face consequences for that disagreement, especially prominent people who disagreed would face consequences for that.
In a democratic society.
I mean, I don't think we actually had a democracy the last three years. I think we've had essentially a biomedical security state, a biomedical security. I mean, I'm not going to say the word dictatorship really, but an authoritarian power that ruled. It wasn't really.
That's a strong statement, Dr. J.
I mean, I think would a democracy allow a regime to persist that systematically crushes free speech? Would a democracy allow a regime to persist that systematically encourages? I mean, we do have like ugly histories of discrimination in against marginalized groups in our democracies.
Well, you might say yes if there was a possibility that it would protect people. You might even say that.
But we're talking about like previously not marginalized groups that were now like enormous parts of the population are now marginalized. I mean, I think you really only get that with authoritarian power. Like even the ugly history in the United States and elsewhere where democracies produced marginalization, it was authoritarian power that was producing that marginalization. Right. So
I have to then ask, you were invited by Elon Musk to go to Twitter land headquarters to look at your account. What happened? Can you tell the audience what happened with your account?
Sure. So actually I should tell the story about speech. Just to follow up on this authoritarian power, this is directly related and why I believe I have this opinion. During the pandemic, governments around the world, including the American government, essentially clamped down on free speech. They developed an infrastructure to pressure social media companies so that speech that contradicted what public health authorities thought and said was not allowed, or was labeled as misinformation, or was essentially either outright censored or socially denigrated. Right. That's why we have to be careful about saying the I word. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. But it wasn't just that they did this like by just randomly. This happened because the governments used power that they really should never have had in democratic society. Right? They're saying that the argument that the governments make is that we're going to stop misinformation from spreading because misinformation kills. But in fact, they censored violating free speech rights in order to protect themselves from criticism against their own misinformation. Like imagine if an open conversation had been allowed to happen. It would have been very, very difficult to socially denigrate large classes of people on the basis of a false notion that the vaccine stops transmission.
That's a crime. It sounds like what they did was a crime. So they colluded with big tech to censor or at least.
So I think so. You asked about Elon. So like we're getting to that. But I think the governments were primarily responsible. I think the big tech, their economic interest is to allow free speech on their platforms. They were very afraid that governments would use their regulatory power to question them. The reason I know this is I'm a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Biden administration. It was brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices. And in this lawsuit, we basically the judge allowed us to depose a dozen high federal officials to read to look in part of the discovery look at their communications with big tech. And what we found was this pattern of big government officials, including direct advisors to President Biden, threatening YouTube, threatening Facebook, threatening Twitter to censor ideas and people, or else.
Threatening, because the other side is, no, we didn't threaten. So you're saying,
Well, I mean, it's
threatened.
like how what you have is like, emails with where this guy, or direct phone conversations with the deputy advisor to the president of the United States saying, look, if you don't do this, people are dying. And the implicit threat is the governments have regulatory power over these companies. If they can make their lives very, very difficult. And the president of the United States gets up and says, look, these companies are spreading information, they're killing people. It is almost impossible for a social media company then to stand up and say no.
Really? I'm June from Canada. I started looking into some of the, I didn't do my own research. I'm looking into the research that other people have done. And you're telling me that big tech companies couldn't do something similar and say,
it's not a question of truth, June.
This really seems odd that the government's coming to us and saying, you need to stop this. And they're saying it's because millions of people are going to die. Gee, maybe because of free speech and our adherence to it, maybe I should look into this and push back. Maybe I should call a news outlet and say, and I think actually Zuckerberg did on the Joe Rogan show. I think he all pretty much admitted that was happening. But if a layperson could do it, surely a tech company could say.
So you're thinking like an individual, not thinking like a company, right? The companies.
Yeah, they have more power.
No, the companies. No. So you're missing this. So the company's incentives are to make money, right? So the company is not. They're not. Expertise isn't in epidemiology. They're responding to the pattern of demand for their products and the regulatory bodies around them. Right? They're not going to go and make the case, oh, we know better than your public health authorities.
No, not we know better, but we need to bring in more players.
They're not. It's easier just to comply, and that's exactly what they did.
Yeah.
And so
where is their responsibility in it all? I'm not saying the government didn't have a responsibility, but
I think so. You brought up Elon, right? So Elon, he buys Twitter because he wants to restore free speech,
perhaps that's why he bought it.
That's actually that's what he told me in person when I met with him. And in fact, what he did when he first bought the company was he opens up the books, the databases, inviting in independent journalists to come and look. And one of these independent journalists, Barry Weiss, actually found my name on a database that said I was blacklisted by Twitter.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was Matt Taibbi.
No, it was Barry Weiss. Yeah. Okay. And the reason, and the thing is, I was blacklisted. It turns out the day I joined Twitter. Why would I hadn't said anything really to warrant the blacklisting, right? It was government pressure on Twitter that caused that to happen. And I think you could talk about whether the company should be blamed. I mean, I don't think that they have no responsibility. But I think the fundamental responsibility lies in governments that used its force to pressure these companies to do something that was really against their economic interest. Their economic interest is to allow free speech, and yet they acted in ways against that because they were afraid of. They were called into Congress and asked why they're not censoring more. Mm-hmm. Right. So you have this like tremendous pressure. It's really, I mean, I can understand why the companies buckled at this pressure. I completely can understand this.
You didn't buckle at this pressure. I'm
a fringe epidemiologist, June.
I have to say this in case I forget. But thank you so much for the way you have conducted yourself over the course of this pandemic with integrity, honesty, transparency. You say, I don't know when you don't know. And with tremendous amount of courage, and yet you're still gracious to those, in this case, big tech companies that didn't act similarly. It's astounding, and I know it's cost you. I know you've paid a great price if you lost 30 pounds, and I just have to say thank you for everything that you've done.
It's very kind of you, but
Yeah,
it's really,
well,
it's my
it's the
job
truth.
is to, I mean, I went into medicine, and, in public health in order to use whatever talents I have to try to make the lives of people better.
Didn't everybody? It just seems like they're all, anybody in public health is, that's their goal, is to make the lives of people better, whether it's
I think it's, the thing is,
especially government. That's what, we hired them to do that. This is, all of this is leading me to something Daniel Schmachtenberger said. He's a thought leader. And basically he said, if you don't get involved, if you don't teach your citizens about democracy and about the government that they're under, the power will concentrate into the hands of a few. And it has seemed like these last few years, and it's an emergency, you have to make decisions, but there's got to be a check on it. If people don't get involved, all these things happen. Imagine if all these independent bloggers, podcasters, media outlets didn't get involved. What kind of story would we have? We would have, what kind of story would we have?
I mean, I think the structure, okay, so now I'm going to put on my economics hat instead of my public health hat.
Sure.
I think,
Oh yeah, because you have a PhD in
economics. Yeah. So I think that societies are that work well are structured so that the incentives to do the right thing overwhelm the other desires that people may have, so that the incentives point people in the right direction. The public health authorities and the social media companies, even the governments themselves, all of the incentives are structured incorrectly during this pandemic. And so, like, like the question is, like, how much culpability should there be in that? My general reaction is, if we and to get back to the reform idea, if we restructure public health so that people have an incentive to do the right thing, it won't matter if there are people that are morally weak, so that during in a setting where the incentives are not pointed in the right direction, that they'll we're saying we're criticizing them for doing the wrong thing. But if the structures are set up, the incentive structures are set up so that they do the right thing, even though they may themselves be morally weak, it won't matter that they're morally weak. I think most of us are morally weak.
I thought the structure was set up to do that.
It's not. I mean, as we talked about earlier, right? About the having, for instance, like having a small number of people sitting atop tens of billions of dollars of public health funding. I'm sorry, research funding, also in charge of giving advice about how to structure public health. That's a conflict of interest. Essentially, it silences all the scientists that they fund or potentially fund.
It's interesting because I was watching Yuval Noah Harari, not my favorite author, but on the Lex Friedman podcast, and he said, what's happening in Israel, they're trying to get rid of the Supreme Court, but in America you have all these checks and balances. It seems like we don't.
Yeah.
Not we, as in I'm a Canadian, but in the West, it seems like what we thought was in place and the structure is actually not there. And now you're talking about reform. Are you integrally involved in reform?
I mean,
what's your role in that?
So I'm just me. I don't. My role is trying to advocate what I see, and based on my analysis. So I wrote a document with 7 other of my friends who are epidemiologists, immunologists, clinicians, called the Norfolk Group document, NORFOK group document. You can go find it on norfolkgroup.org. It's an agenda for what what questions an honest COVID commission would ask. I think that's the first step, an honest evaluation of the efficacy and the wisdom of the policies that we follow. What harms were actually caused? What do we know about about these things? Actually, the kind of conversation we're having now, done more formally at scale, I think is what we really need. I think a lot of the problem is you mentioned checks and balances. That's really the fundamental problem here, right? You had a relatively small group of people with a tremendous amount of power. And so when they got it wrong, they had the power to suppress the correction. Public health has arrogated to itself, or I don't know what the right word is, brought into itself this this idea that they know so well what the right thing to do is, that they can brook no dissent in an emergency. When in fact, what should happen is structures be set up so that that there are bodies that can correct them. That now, in principle, you would think that the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary branches of government could correct them. But in fact, the executive branch of government didn't correct them during the pandemic. A lot of the public health authorities acted on the aura of executive power.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The judiciary was, I personally was an expert witness in a very large number of anti-lockdown, anti-mandate cases, all pro bono. And my observation is that a lot of the judges were so scared, not just about the disease, but also that they were scared that they were going to be accused of making decisions that killed people, that they ignored their obligation to protecting basic civil rights.
So we think, I had the illusion that we've advanced. I really did, until COVID hit. I thought, no, this can't be happening. So many of these reports came out, and I've been really tentative in my own trying to understand all of this. But as I listen to you talk, I'm getting more and more disillusioned. And there really needs to be more structures put in place. So that's why I was asking earlier about Pfizer. So why was there not an independent body to look into that?
So the regulatory bodies failed, right? So the bodies that were responsible for overseeing Pfizer's rollout of the vaccine were in the U.S., were the U.S. FDA, which could have asked that Pfizer to run a different kind of trial, one that checked for transmission, that could have asked for longer term data, that could have asked for more rapid disclosure about vaccine injuries, right? That could have asked for all of these things that yet didn't. It's a regulatory failure, right? So like they were so scared that people were going to think the vaccine is dangerous and stop taking it, that they permitted this uncertainty to continue long past at the time it was never warranted, but should they just to continue, right? If they'd asked for a trial, they had the power to ask Pfizer to run a very different trial, and Pfizer would have run that trial.
They would have.
Yeah,
If
because otherwise they wouldn't get the vaccine approved.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, so the regulatory bodies have the power, they just fail to use it in part, and the question is why?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think a lot of it stems from a lot of these regulatory bodies, they see themselves as guarantors of the public health. There's this massive threat to public health with this virus going around, and they like many other people were grasping at anything they could find to try to stop it from happening, even at the expense of failing at their own mission.
It seems almost impossible that happened.
And yet it did.
And yet it did.
Yeah.
What a regulatory body, how can you even know though? What are they learning from this? Are they having these discussions?
Unfortunately, I have to say that the choices of people to replace the leaders of the US CDC, the National Institute of Health, and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease have not filled me with a lot of confidence that they've learned much from this. A lot of, and you can understand this, right? So when there is a catastrophic failure, as we've experienced in public health over the last 3.5 years, you either, as a body, acknowledge the failure and then try to make reforms. Like, so when there's a plane crash, for instance, there's in the US there's a body called the NTSB, Transportation Safety Board or something. I forget exactly the acronym, that will do an independent evaluation of what happened. They'll look at the black box data, and then they'll recommend reforms. Here, you should be checking this and this and this in order for the plane not to crash in the future. Right. Or after a patient dies in a hospital, there'll be something called a morbidity and mortality conference, where the doctors and nurses responsible for the care of the patient might have a little conference, and they'll discuss and say, but usually it can get pretty heated, but the goal isn't to point blame. It's to say, okay, here's what we did wrong. Here's how we can fix it in the future so we don't have this kind of problem again. That's what a responsible organization does. an irresponsible organization pretends as if everything went right and then just double down. And that's unfortunately, I think, what the regulatory bodies are doing right now. It's now a political question. I had hoped it would be simply a scientific question, one of like honest people looking at this with the data and then deciding. I think I still have some hope for that. That could happen still, but I think it's at this point pretty fundamentally a political question. Does the public want this kind of evaluation or not?
Wow.
Right. So, and I think
I would never even have thought that we wouldn't. Of course we do.
Well, June, you and I do, but it's an open question, right? It's a political question, right? So in the United States, in both the Republican and Democratic parties, you have people who are running who essentially are telling the story that they did everything right. You have Joe Biden, who's running, and he's blocked a inquiry, like an honest bipartisan COVID inquiry, blocked by the Biden administration. Right on his side, you have RFK Jr. essentially criticizing on the Democratic side, you have criticizing him. And will he get a hearing in the Democratic Party? It's unclear. On the Republican side, you have President Trump, who ordered the lockdown and who was responsible for this Operation Warp Speed that brought the vaccine into existence. I mean, he could defend those things, but instead he's essentially gaslighting someone like Ron DeSantis, who was opposed to the lockdown, who actually wanted to use the vaccine to protect older people. That's the advice I gave him, and that's what the advice he followed. And so you in principle now have, in the United States anyways, on both parties, the opportunity for a vote that says that these policies were wrong and bad. And it's an open question now. What will happen? Which way will the public go? And I don't know the answer to that. In Canada, you had Danielle Smith take over the Alberta premiership, replacing Jason Kenney. That seems like a pretty clear repudiation of the leadership of Kenney, who instituted the lockdown and the vaccine mandates and all of the kinds of things. But in Canada, more broadly,
I'm not sure you can make that connection, but.
Well, I mean, I don't know
why she was elected. I'm not sure if that's.
I think the lockdowns played a pretty important role in that, in my view.
Okay. Sorry, finish your thought.
Yeah, but will Canada more broadly reject the leadership of Justin Trudeau, who imposed this vaccine mandate, who violated the civil liberties of those truckers, and especially the leaders who freezing their bank accounts, who enacted pretty draconian speech restrictions and went after prominent academics,
who expanded the definition of the CSIS Act in order to justify the use of the Emergencies Act.
I think so. Questions.
So what you're saying though is we should get. You're saying are the people wanting this?
Yeah.
So the people need to get involved. I am responsible. I feel like I'm responsible, and that's the most unselfish thing that I could do, is to get involved, get informed, and try to understand what's going on. And I have responsibility and culpability when things go wrong. And as a nation, as a society, we have to stand up. We have to get your message out and similar messages so that we can have these discussions and encourage those in power to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately now it's a political question. If we're really still our democracies, then the question then will fall to the people. What kind of society we want to live in? Do we want to live in a liberal democracy where the Enlightenment principles hold, and there isn't a high clerisy of science that can abrogate our rights based on their reading of what's dangerous and what's not? Or
I think everybody would say yes to that.
I'm not clear on that. It's not clear.
Everybody would say yes, but how do you get there?
No, because I think that what we saw during the last 3.5 years was the people said no to that. I think that
but I think they said no to that because they thought they were saying yes to safe and effective and security. I think if they had the entire story and picture, they might have said, wait a minute, we need more discussion. I'm not sure people just were saying, I don't want to believe that anyway. I don't want to believe that.
I think it's an open question.
Yeah, okay.
I have the same hope you do, that people will reject it. But in the US, there's a divide between the parties. In the Democratic Party, 70% of I saw some poll that 70% of the Democratic Party believes that restrictions in speech are warranted in the case of public health. And the way they couch it is you have to suppress misinformation. Even in the Republican Party, I think it's like 30 or 40% are in favor of this kind of suppression of speech. So I don't know for certain that our public wants the kind of free speech rights we once enjoyed. The public wants the Enlightenment. I mean, like as far as science is concerned, you can't have scientific progress if there is a high clerisy that decides what's true and what's false.
Right.
Science only advances in an atmosphere of free speech without that kind of repression.
Yeah, but something happened prior to COVID that would lead people to say we want the suppression of misinformation, and I think that's key. What an individual thinks is misinformation is thought of as misinformation because of the broader messaging, and that's where I think corporate media has to take responsibility as well, and allow these open debates and not shut down dialogue. And I don't think the average person would say, yeah, you know what, we really shouldn't talk to one another, and this whole misinformation thing, it's a good thing. I just don't think that if it was a different, like they were nudged into thinking that misinformation was misinformation when it wasn't.
Yeah.
So I think that plays a part in it. If somebody is telling me a message and then I start repeating that message, and then public health says, well, look, they want the mask. Well, we want the mask because you said we want the mask. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think there's a responsibility for I think all of this is saying to me, get involved, do what you can, write a letter. So many people have said, I can't do anything.
I agree with you that that's the solution. I think the solution is that the public needs to, and I hope that you're right, that the vast majority of the public agrees that this kind of like, sort of old-fashioned liberal societies that we want, that I thought we enjoyed before the pandemic. I'm sure there were problems. I'm sure that if I go back and look, I was probably mistaken about to some extent around that. But that norm that we have in our head of free societies with free peoples interacting freely, of a scientific establishment that's aimed at knowledge production and production of discoveries for the good of the public, of governments acting benevolently. I think it's not possible to believe that we had that during the pandemic. And then the question is, what kind of society do we want to live in? Like, I think we can either choose, and this is the direction I think we're headed, a biomedical security state, a state where a small clerisy essentially controls the levers of power such that there's surveillance, there's like essentially like this structure designed to create this illusion of safety from biological threats and other threats at the cost of our basic civil liberties. Or we can go back to this notion that free speech protects us from these threats much better than Tony Fauci would. I think it's an open question which direction we'll go at this point.
And I hope we can continue this discussion. I think it's time to wind it down.
So good, June, to talk with you.
Yeah, this has just been a real blessing. I actually learned a lot. I'm so appreciative of you being on Conversation Cafe. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.